The morning of March 8, 1942, began with an announcement on the radio that would change everything for 10-year-old Rika van der Werf and her family in Batavia, capital of the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch colonial government, after only 8 weeks of resistance, had surrendered to the Japanese Empire. Within hours, soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army were marching through the tree-lined streets of the tropical city, their rifles and bayonets glinting in the equatorial sun. For the approximately 100,000 Dutch civilians living in the Indies, most of them born there and knowing no other home, the occupation meant the beginning of a nightmare that would last 3.5 years. Among them were roughly 40,000 children, European or mixed-race Dutch-Indonesian, who would spend their formative years behind barbed wire in what survivors would later describe as passive extermination camps. These children, some barely old enough to walk, would become prisoners of war in all but name, subject to deliberate starvation, disease, and brutality that killed thousands and left the survivors permanently scarred. The Dutch East Indies, the sprawling archipelago that would later become Indonesia, had been a Dutch colony for over 3 centuries. By the 1940s, it was one of the richest colonies in the world, producing rubber, oil, tin, and other resources essential to modern industry. The European population lived comfortable lives, with large houses, servants, and the privileges that came with colonial rule. Children grew up in a world of tropical abundance, swimming in warm seas, climbing coconut palms, speaking Malay as easily as Dutch. They attended good schools, had ample food, and knew little of hardship. The war in Europe seemed distant, though after Germany invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, the colony was technically cut off from the motherland. Still, life continued much as before, with parents reassuring children that the troubles were far away and would not reach them. The Japanese invasion shattered these illusions. Beginning on January 10, 1942, Japanese forces swept through the archipelago with overwhelming speed and force. The Dutch military, outnumbered and outgunned, could offer only token resistance. The Royal Netherlands East Indies Army fought bravely but hopelessly, and by early March, surrender was inevitable. When it came, the European population faced an uncertain future. The Japanese, who had presented themselves as Asian liberators freeing the region from European colonialism, showed their true intentions quickly. Europeans were classified as enemy aliens, subject to internment. Within weeks, the roundups began. The internment process was chaotic and traumatic. Families received orders to report to assembly points, bringing only what they could carry. Many believed, or desperately wanted to believe, that the internment would be temporary, that conditions would be reasonable, that families would remain together. All these hopes proved false. Men were separated from women and children almost immediately, sent to different camps. Husbands and fathers disappeared behind barbed wire, leaving wives and children to face imprisonment without protection or support. For children like 10-year-old Jan de Vries, watching his father marched away under guard, the separation was incomprehensible and terrifying. He would not see his father again for 3.5 years, and when they finally reunited, both had changed so much they barely recognized each other. The women and children were transported to camps established throughout Java and other islands. These were not purpose-built facilities, but rather existing neighborhoods that were fenced off, with residents evicted to make room for prisoners. In Batavia, the Tjideng camp became one of the largest and most notorious, eventually holding over 10,000 women and children in a space designed for a fraction of that number. The camp was located in what had been a pleasant suburb, with neat rows of houses and gardens. Under Japanese administration, it became a hell of overcrowding, hunger, and death. Families were assigned to houses that might have been comfortable for one family, but now held 10 or 15. Privacy vanished. Every space, from living rooms to verandas to storage sheds, became sleeping quarters. Rika van der Werf and her mother and 2 younger siblings were assigned to a house in Tjideng along with 3 other families. They claimed a corner of what had once been a dining room, marking their territory with the few possessions they had brought. The mattresses lay side by side on the floor, leaving barely enough room to walk. The house had 1 bathroom shared by approximately 50 people. The kitchen, once equipped for preparing family meals, now had to serve all the house's occupants with minimal fuel and supplies. The first weeks were a desperate scramble to establish routines, to figure out how to survive in conditions that seemed impossible to endure for long. But long endurance was exactly what would be required. Food became the central preoccupation from the very beginning. The Japanese provided rations that were deliberately inadequate, calculated to keep prisoners alive but weakened. The daily ration consisted of a small portion of rice, perhaps 200 grams, along with watery soup containing vegetable scraps and occasionally tiny amounts of meat. Children whose bodies needed calories for growth received the same portions as adults, or sometimes even less. Within months, every child in the camp showed signs of malnutrition. Growth stopped. Ribs became visible through skin. Bellies swelled with the hunger edema that marked advanced starvation. Hair turned brittle and began to fall out. The younger children, unable to understand why they were always hungry, cried constantly. Mothers who had no food to give them suffered the special agony of watching their children waste away. The camp administration, under the command of Lieutenant Kenichi Sonei, implemented policies designed to maximize suffering. Sonei, who would later become known as one of the most brutal camp commandants in the Indies, seemed to take pleasure in inflicting cruelty. He reduced rations systematically, cutting them whenever he decided prisoners were receiving too much. He instituted punishments for minor infractions that included withholding food entirely, forcing prisoners to stand in the tropical sun for hours, or beating them with bamboo canes. Children who broke rules, even children as young as 6 or 7, were not exempt from punishment. They too stood in the sun, were beaten, had food withheld. The message was clear: age provided no protection, childhood no sanctuary.
The lack of medical care compounded the malnutrition. The camp hospital was staffed by Dutch doctors who were themselves prisoners, working with almost no medicine or equipment. When children fell ill, which happened constantly in the unsanitary and overcrowded conditions, there was little that could be done. Dysentery swept through the camp in waves, leaving children dehydrated and weak. Malaria, dengue fever, and other tropical diseases found fertile ground among prisoners with no resistance. Beriberi, caused by vitamin B deficiency, made legs swell and hearts fail. Children died regularly, their small bodies too weakened to fight infections that proper nutrition and medicine could have easily defeated. The death rate in Tjideng was appalling, particularly among the youngest children. Infants and toddlers proved especially vulnerable, their small reserves quickly exhausted by illness and malnutrition. Mothers who lost children faced the nightmare of having to continue somehow, to care for surviving siblings, to find reasons to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. The camp had a small cemetery that filled rapidly with graves marked by simple wooden crosses. By the end of the war, thousands of prisoners had died in camps across the Indies, and children made up a disproportionate number of those deaths. Yet the children also showed remarkable resilience and adaptability. They created their own world within the camp, finding ways to play even in the midst of horror. With no toys except what they could improvise, they invented games using stones, sticks, and scraps of cloth. They told stories, sang songs, and maintained friendships that provided emotional sustenance when physical sustenance was lacking. The older children took on adult responsibilities, caring for younger siblings when mothers were too weak or had to work. 10-year-olds learned to cook rice over makeshift fires, to wash clothes in cold water with no soap, to comfort crying babies when no adult was available. Education continued in secret despite Japanese prohibitions. Teachers among the prisoners organized clandestine classes, teaching children to read, write, and do arithmetic using whatever materials they could find. Paper was precious, so children wrote in tiny letters to make it last. Textbooks were recreated from memory, with teachers writing out lessons by hand and passing them from student to student. The Japanese discovered and shut down these schools regularly, punishing teachers and confiscating materials, but the schools would restart in new locations with new methods. The determination to maintain education reflected a refusal to accept that the children had no future, that learning and development should stop because of imprisonment. The camp organized itself with remarkable efficiency despite the circumstances. Prisoners elected leaders, established committees for food distribution, sanitation, education, and welfare. They created work details so that necessary tasks were shared. They developed informal systems of support where those with more helped those with less. This self-organization provided structure and purpose, preventing complete descent into chaos. For children, watching adults work together to solve problems taught lessons about community and cooperation that no textbook could provide. They learned that humanity could survive even in conditions designed to destroy it. As the war progressed and Japan's military situation deteriorated, conditions in the camps worsened. By 1944, rations had been cut to near starvation levels. The rice allocation shrank to perhaps 100 grams per day, barely a handful. The soup became thinner, sometimes nothing more than hot water with a few vegetable leaves floating in it. Hunger became constant, consuming, all-encompassing. Children talked endlessly about food, describing meals they remembered from before the war in elaborate detail, building fantasies of banquets they would have when freedom came. These conversations were both comfort and torture, offering escape into imagination while highlighting the desperate reality of starvation. The physical effects of prolonged malnutrition were devastating. By 1945, most children in the camps were skeletal, their bodies having consumed every reserve of fat and then begun consuming muscle tissue. They moved slowly, conserving energy, too weak for even simple exertion. Their hair fell out in clumps. Their teeth loosened and fell out. Their skin developed sores that would not heal. Intellectually, the malnutrition took its toll as well. Children who had been bright and active became listless and apathetic, unable to concentrate, losing interest in everything except food. The development of growing brains was arrested, leaving gaps in cognitive function that would never fully recover. In early 1945, as Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, the Japanese began preparing for final measures. In camps across the Indies, plans were drawn up for mass executions of internees. The Japanese could not allow prisoners to be liberated and become witnesses to how they had been treated. Lists were compiled, execution methods discussed, dates tentatively set. Only the sudden end of the war prevented these plans from being carried out. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the internees were saved from what would have been wholesale slaughter. But salvation came too late for the thousands who had already died from starvation, disease, and brutality.
The period immediately following Japanese surrender was confused and dangerous. The camps were liberated, but the situation in the Indies was chaotic. Indonesian nationalists, seeing an opportunity for independence, declared a republic and began fighting to prevent the return of Dutch colonial rule. This period, known as the Bersiap, saw violence directed against Europeans and mixed-race Indonesians caught between contending forces. Former internees found themselves in a situation hardly safer than the camps, vulnerable to armed gangs, uncertain where safety could be found. Allied forces worked to evacuate Europeans, but the logistics were overwhelming and the security situation precarious. When Rika van der Werf finally left Tjideng in September 1945, she weighed 30 kilograms, less than half her pre-war weight. She had not grown at all during 3.5 years of captivity, her development arrested by starvation. She had chronic dysentery, malaria, and multiple parasitic infections. Most of her hair had fallen out. She barely recognized her father when they reunited, and he struggled to accept that this skeletal child was his daughter. The reunion, which should have been purely joyful, was complicated by trauma, by changed relationships, by the impossibility of returning to the life that had existed before the war. The evacuation of internees proceeded in stages, with the sickest and most vulnerable given priority. Children and their mothers were among the first to leave, transported to hospitals in Singapore, Australia, or directly to the Netherlands. For many children, this was their first time leaving the Indies, the only home they had ever known. They boarded ships bound for a country they had heard about but never seen, a cold northern land that bore no resemblance to the tropical paradise of their births. The voyage itself was difficult, with many still too sick to travel comfortably, but it represented movement toward safety, toward a future that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of imprisonment. Arrival in the Netherlands brought new challenges. The country itself was devastated from 5 years of German occupation, with food shortages, housing crises, and a population traumatized by war. The returning Indies families found little sympathy or support. Many Dutch regarded them as privileged colonials who had finally gotten their comeuppance, not understanding or caring about what they had endured. Housing was scarce, so families crowded into temporary shelters or lived with relatives who had no space for them. The cold, the unfamiliar food, the gray skies and bare trees all combined to create a sense of displacement and loss. For the children, adjustment was particularly difficult. They had left the Indies at various ages, some barely remembering life before the camps, others old enough to carry detailed memories of both worlds. In the Netherlands, there were exotic oddities, children from the colonies who spoke with strange accents and told stories about tropical camps that sounded like fabrications. Their peers had no framework for understanding what they had experienced, no ability to empathize with suffering so far outside normal experience. The Indies children learned to stay silent, to not speak of the camps, to pretend they were normal when they felt profoundly marked and different. The physical recovery took months or years. Children had to be carefully refed, their damaged digestive systems unable to process normal food quantities. They gained weight slowly, painfully, their bodies reluctant to trust that food would continue to be available. Growth resumed, but many never reached the height they would have achieved without years of starvation. Dental damage was permanent, teeth lost to malnutrition never replaced. The parasitic infections required extended treatment. Some health problems, including weakened immune systems and chronic digestive issues, lasted lifetimes. The medical community, struggling to understand the long-term effects of childhood starvation, offered little help. The psychological damage proved even more difficult to address. The children of the Indies camps suffered from what would now be recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, symptoms that included nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, problems with emotional regulation, and challenges forming secure attachments. In the 1940s and 1950s, mental health treatment for children barely existed, and trauma therapy was unknown. The children were expected to simply get over it, to be grateful for survival, to move on with their lives. Most tried to comply, burying their experiences, avoiding discussion of the camps, presenting normal facades while struggling internally with memories and emotions they could not process or escape.
Many of the children who survived the Indies camps struggled throughout their lives with the aftermath of their experiences. Some developed eating disorders, hoarding food compulsively or unable to throw away anything edible. Others had trouble with intimacy and relationships, the trauma of family separation creating deep-seated fears of abandonment and loss. Still others carried survivor's guilt, haunted by memories of children who had died in the camps, unable to reconcile their own survival with those deaths. The silence that surrounded their experiences made healing even more difficult, with few outlets for sharing stories or finding others who understood. It was not until decades later, as the survivors aged and the cultural understanding of trauma evolved, that many felt able to speak openly about their camp experiences. In the 1980s and 1990s, organizations formed to support Indies camp survivors, providing spaces where stories could be shared and validated. Books began to be published, memoirs and histories that documented what had happened in the camps. The Netherlands gradually acknowledged the suffering of Indies internees, establishing memorial days and offering limited compensation. But for many survivors, recognition came too late, after decades of silence and struggle. Jeroen Brouwers, who had been a young child in Tjideng, wrote a powerful autobiographical novel called Sunken Red that captured the experience of camp childhood and its lasting effects. His work, and that of other survivor authors, helped bring the Indies camps into public consciousness, challenging the historical narrative that had largely ignored civilian internment in Asia while focusing on European camps. The books showed that the suffering in the Indies had been comparable or exceeded conditions in many European camps, and that the children who had endured it deserved recognition and remembrance. The death toll from the Indies camps was staggering. Of approximately 100,000 Dutch civilians interned, about 14,000 to 16,000 died during captivity or shortly after liberation. Children made up a disproportionate share of these deaths, their young bodies unable to survive the combination of starvation, disease, and abuse. Entire families were wiped out. Siblings who entered camps together died within months of each other. Mothers who sacrificed their own meager rations to feed children died of starvation while their children survived. The losses were catastrophic and permanent, leaving survivors with voids that could never be filled. The Japanese treatment of civilians in the Indies was later documented in war crimes trials held in Batavia and other cities. Commandants like Sonei were prosecuted for their brutality, with testimony from survivors detailing the systematic starvation, the beatings, the deliberate withholding of medical care. Some were convicted and executed, others received prison sentences. But many Japanese officials and guards escaped justice, either dying before they could be tried or never being charged. The trials provided some measure of accountability, but could not undo the damage or restore what had been lost. Fewer than a handful of child survivors from the Indies camps remain alive. Most are in their 80s and 90s, the last living witnesses to what happened in places like Tjideng. As they age and their numbers dwindle, there is urgency in recording their testimonies, preserving their stories before they are lost. Museums and archives in the Netherlands and Indonesia work to document the camps, collecting photographs, letters, and interviews. Memorial sites have been established, though many of the actual camp locations have been built over and no longer bear physical traces of what occurred there. The children who were prisoners in the Dutch East Indies during World War II represent one of the war's most overlooked groups of victims. They suffered for years in conditions designed to kill them slowly, watched friends and siblings die, emerged traumatized and damaged, and then faced decades of silence and neglect. Their story challenges comfortable narratives about the war and forces recognition of suffering that occurred far from Europe's battlefields. They were children who lost their childhoods, prisoners who were never officially recognized as such, survivors who carried burdens most people could never imagine. Their voices, preserved in memoirs and testimonies, remind us that war's cruelest victims are often those least able to defend themselves, and that the costs of conflict extend far beyond battlefields into the lives of innocent children caught in circumstances beyond their control or comprehension.